When I think back, I always linger on that moment when things changed. The kind of change that turns my head and ties my heart in a knot. Some memories stand out more than others, but one of them, the one I haven't told anyone about until now, holds me tight. It's a story of feelings, of a devotion that turned dangerous, of a young man's unyielding love that led us both down a dark road. And, as I promised, the best part comes at the end. The day I married Daniel's father, I had no idea what I was getting myself into. At the time, Daniel was a quiet young man, only in his 20s, and he didn't like to share his thoughts openly. Even then I noticed that he carried a shadow within him, a sadness that haunted him like an uninvited ghost. His mother had died a few years before, and I was just beginning to realize the emptiness she had left behind. In those first months, he watched me carefully, as if trying to see if I could be trusted. His deep green eyes followed me as I walked around the house, cooked dinner, or just sat at the table with his father. I couldn't understand what was going on behind those eyes. At first I thought it was simple curiosity, the way a young man might explore a new presence in his life. But over time I realized it was much more than that. Daniel's gaze lingered on me for longer than was allowed, and though I tried to brush it off as harmless, it made my skin goosebumps. It was a crisp fall evening when things started to change. Daniel and I were alone in the house. My husband, Richard, was away on a business trip. I remember the smell of roasting chestnuts coming from the kitchen, and the fading sunlight pouring in through the window, warming the room with a golden glow. Daniel stood at the window, looking out into the yard, a cigarette between his fingers. He turned to me and said in his quiet, almost hesitant voice, "You look lonely, Eleanor." His words took me by surprise. I hadn't realized I looked lonely not to anyone else, and certainly not to Daniel. In fact, I suppose I was lonely. Richard was always working, and I realized that his passion for his work far outweighed his passion for me. I didn't want to show it, but Daniel's eyes were so serious, so deeply sincere, something inside me shifted. "Yeah, probably do," I said, trying to keep my tone light. I smiled, but the smile faded when I saw the way he looked at me. There was no pity in it, only understanding, which made my heart ache. He nodded and took a step closer. "I don't like seeing you sad," he said. He was so close I could feel the warmth emanating from him, the scent of his cologne mixed with the sharpness of his cigarette. My heart pounded against my ribs. I wanted to take a step back to put distance between us, but I couldn't budge. Not long after that night, I began to see Daniel looking at me in a different light, not with the cold eyes of a son sizing up his stepmother, but with the longing gaze of a young man helplessly in love. I had to stop him. I should have pushed him away and set clear boundaries, but instead I found myself drawn to his quiet tension, the way his eyes softened when they stopped on me. There was a storm raging inside him. I could feel it even then, but I was too far removed from it to see it as a danger. I looked forward to the time when Richard wasn't home and Daniel and I were alone. We'd stay up late, talking about everything: his mother, school, my own dreams and fears. He listened to me like Richard never had, and before I knew it, I was craving his attention, his warmth, the way he made me feel noticed. It wasn't long before Daniel confessed his feelings to me. It was late, the house was quiet, and we were sitting in the living room. He reached out and took my hand in his. His fingers were warm and trembled slightly, and his eyes searched mine for a sign that he wasn't about to make a terrible mistake. "I know I shouldn't feel this way," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "But I love you, Eleanor. Not the way a son loves his stepmother. I love you in a way that scares me." I had to pull away. I should have told him that what he was feeling was wrong, that it couldn't be. But instead, I squeezed his hand, and my heart ached with a strange, undeniable longing. "Daniel," I whispered, my voice caught in my throat. "You don't know what you're saying." He leaned closer, his forehead almost touching mine. "I understand," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "I've never been so sure of anything in my life. I love you and I would do anything for you. His words still echoed in my head long after that night. Anything, anything at all. The weight of that promise scared me. And at the same time, it made me feel something I hadn't felt in years, a sense of power, recklessness, and unbridled desirability. I tried to distance myself, to draw a line that Daniel shouldn't cross, but the more I pushed him away, the more he seemed determined to prove his devotion. One night, he came to me with an idea, a wild, dangerous idea. Richard had money, more money than he knew what to do with, and Daniel wanted to take it. He told me he could make sure Richard never found out what had happened. He told me we could run away together, start over somewhere away from everything that was holding us back. The tension in his eyes was almost frightening. It was the look of a man with nothing to lose, willing to risk everything for the woman he loved. At first, I was terrified. I told him he was crazy, that I could never be involved in something so dangerous, so wrong. But Daniel was relentless. He talked about freedom, about a life where we could be together without fear or shame. And slowly, against my better judgment, I realized that I was drawn to his vision. The thought of breaking free from a cold, loveless marriage, of starting my life anew with a man who adored me was intoxicating. The plan was simple enough, or so it seemed to Daniel. He would forge Richard's signature, access his accounts, and transfer the money to an offshore account. I wouldn't have to do anything but wait. He told me he'd take care of everything, that no one would ever find out. I had to stop him. I should have seen the danger, the madness in his eyes, but I was too far away. I wanted to believe him, to believe that we could have the life he promised me. The night it all happened, I could barely breathe. Daniel was calm, almost eerily calm, as he worked on Richard's computer, his fingers moving quickly over the keys. I watched him from the doorway, my heart pounding in my chest, fear and excitement swirling inside me. When he finally turned to me and a smile spread across his face, I felt a strange mixture of relief and dread. It was over. There was no going back. We left that night, the two of us, driving away from the house in silence, and the weight of what we had done hung heavy between us. I remember looking at Daniel, his face illuminated by the dashboard light, and feeling a strange calm. He'd done it. He'd done it for me. But things soon went south. Richard discovered the missing money a few days later, and the police got involved before we'd even had a chance to settle into the new life we'd envisioned. We were on the run, hiding in motels, constantly looking over our shoulder. Fear was constant, a shadow following us everywhere. And yet Daniel remained steadfast, his love for me unwavering. I wish I could say that our story had a happy ending, that we found the freedom we were looking for. But the truth is cruel in our lives. Eventually, the authorities caught up with us, and Daniel was led away in handcuffs, his eyes meeting mine one last time as he was led away. There was no anger or regret in them, just love, the love that had driven him to do the unthinkable. And now, sitting here alone, I can't help but think back to that stormy night when it all began. The night Daniel confessed his love for me, the night he promised me he would do anything for me. He kept that promise, even if it meant losing everything. The most interesting thing about this story, I suppose, is not the crime itself or how we ran from the life we once knew. It's that even now, after all that has happened, I can still feel the warmth of his love. It reminds me, like a ghost, of the passion that once burned so brightly between us. A love that was reckless, dangerous, and ultimately doomed, but still real.